What if everything you know about history is wrong? What if the maps hanging in classrooms around the world are missing something enormous? A vast empire that once stretched across continents, wielding technologies we can barely comprehend today, only to vanish so completely that most people have never even heard its name. Tonight, we explore the possibility that the greatest civilization in human history was deliberately erased from our textbooks, our museums, and our collective memory. The name is Tartaria, and if the whispers are true, it was an empire unlike anything the world has ever seen. Imagine waking up tomorrow to discover that entire chapters of history had been torn from every book, deleted from every database, and scrubbed from every monument. Imagine learning that the grand buildings you walk past every day were not built by the people you were told built them, but by a civilization so advanced, so powerful, that its very existence had to be hidden from future generations. This is not the plot of a science fiction novel. This is the claim made by thousands of researchers, historians, and curious minds who believe that Tartaria was real and that its disappearance represents the greatest cover-up in human history. But before we dive into the mystery, let me paint you a picture of what this lost empire might have looked like. Close your eyes and envision cities that stretched beyond the horizon, their skylines dominated by structures that defied the architectural knowledge of their time. Buildings with perfect symmetry, impossible engineering, and a grandeur that made even the greatest palaces of Europe look like humble cottages. These were cities powered by energy sources we have forgotten, connected by transportation networks that spanned continents, inhabited by people who had mastered technologies that today we call impossible. According to those who study Tartaria, this was not a primitive society struggling with basic survival. This was a civilization that had solved problems we are still grappling with today. Free energy that flowed through elaborate networks, architecture that seemed to grow from the earth itself, perfectly integrated with natural forces, social systems that maintained peace across vast distances and diverse populations, and perhaps most remarkably, a level of harmony between human achievement and environmental balance that we have never seen replicated. If this sounds too incredible to believe, you are not alone in that skepticism. The mainstream historical establishment dismisses Tartarian theories as fantasy, pseudoscience, or the product of overactive imaginations. But the believers in this lost empire point to something that is much harder to dismiss. The evidence is hiding in plain sight, scattered across the world in the form of maps, buildings, and historical documents that tell a very different story than the one we have been taught. The word Tartaria itself has a long and documented history. For centuries, European maps labeled vast regions of Asia with this name. From the 13th century onward, cartographers drew sweeping boundaries across what we now call Central Asia, Siberia, parts of China, and regions extending into Eastern Europe. These were not small territories or minor kingdoms. The areas marked as Tartaria on historical maps encompassed millions of square miles, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from the Arctic tundra to the borders of India. But here is where the mystery begins to unfold. While the name Tartaria appears consistently on maps for what actually existed within those boundaries remain hundreds of years, the historical records about strangely vague. European explorers and scholars wrote about Tartarian peoples, Tartarian customs, and Tartarian lands, but their descriptions often contradict each other. Some portrayed the region as wild and uncivilized, populated Others hinted at great by nomadic tribes and barbaric whore, rivaled or surpassed anything cities, advanced technologies, and sophisticated societies that in Europe. This contradiction could such an enormous region, labelled so forms the foundation of the Tartarian mystery. How prominently on maps for so long, remain so poorly understood? How could European cartographers confidently mark borders and territories they knew almost nothing about? And most puzzling of all, why did the name Tartaria gradually disappear from maps and historical accounts, replaced by the smaller, more fragmented nations and regions we recognize today? Those who believe in the lost empire of Tartaria argue that this disappearance was not natural or gradual. They suggest that it was deliberate, systematic, and coordinated. They claim that powerful forces conspired to erase Tartaria from history, breaking up its territories, rewriting its achievements, and attributing its greatest accomplishments to other civilizations. The motivation for such a massive deception, they argue, was fear. Fear of what humanity might learn from Tartarian knowledge. Fear of how Tartarian technologies might disrupt existing power structures. Fear of what it would mean if people discovered that a more advanced, more harmonious way of life had once existed and been deliberately destroyed. The evidence for these claims begins with architecture. Walk through the streets of major cities around the world, from St. Petersburg to San Francisco, from Paris to Chicago, and you will see buildings that seem to belong to another era entirely. Massive structures with intricate stonework, impossible engineering, and a level of craftsmanship that challenges our understanding of 19th and early 20th century construction capabilities. These buildings, according to Tartarian researchers, were not built by the civilizations traditionally credited with their creation. They are the remnants of Tartarian architecture, left standing after the empire's fall, their true origins disguised by fabricated construction histories. Consider the great world's fairs of the late 1800s and early 1900s. Cities like Chicago, San Francisco, and St. Louis suddenly sprouted elaborate temporary pavilions and exhibition halls that rivaled the greatest architectural achievements of their time. These structures, we are told, were built quickly from cheap materials, served their purpose for a few months, and were then demolished just as rapidly. But Tartarian believers of Tartarian cities temporarily see something different in the photographs from these events. They see the Rem revealed to the public under the guise of temporary exhibitions, then hastily destroyed to hide their true origins. The photographs from these world's fairs are indeed striking. The buildings appear too grand, too detailed, too permanent to have been temporary constructions. The craftsmanship visible in even the supposedly disposable structures rivals that of cathedrals and palaces that took decades to complete. And perhaps most tellingly, many of these photographs show the fairgrounds eerily empty of people, as if the cities had been recently abandoned rather than recently built. This leads us to another key element of the Tartarian theory, the concept of the Great Reset. Not a single catastrophic event, but a series of disasters, both natural and artificial, that systematically destroyed Tartarian civilization and allowed its history to be rewritten. The most frequently cited of these disasters is something called the Mud Flood, a mysterious event that believers claim buried much of Tartarian architecture and infrastructure beneath layers of earth and sediment. Evidence for the mud flood is found in cities around the world, where buildings from the 18th and 19th centuries appear to have their lower floors buried underground. windows that now sit at ground level or below, doorways that lead into the earth, and entire architectural elements that seem to have sunk into the soil. Mainstream historians and architects explain these features as the result of natural settling, changing street levels, or practical basement construction. But Tartarian researchers see them as proof that a massive displacement of Earth once covered much of the civilized world, burying the evidence of an advanced society. The timeline of this supposed Great Reset varies among different Tartarian theories, but many place it in the early 1800s, coinciding with a period of unusual global climate events, massive social upheavals, and the rise of the industrial age as we know it. Some believe Masonic wars, the American Civil War, and even go further, suggesting that events like the World Wars of the 20th century were not conflicts between the nations we think they were, but battles to complete the destruction of Tartarian civilization and establish the new world order that emerged in its place. This is where Tartarian theory intersects with broader conspiracy thinking about hidden history and suppressed knowledge. The claim is not just that an empire was destroyed, but that its destruction was followed by a coordinated effort to rewrite history itself. Libraries burned, documents altered, maps redrawn, and entire populations relocated or eliminated to ensure that future generations would never learn what had been lost. The people behind this alleged cover-up vary depending on which version of the theory you encounter. Some point to religious institutions, claiming that the Vatican and other church hierarchies feared Tartarian spiritual knowledge and technology. Others suggest that emerging industrial powers deliberately destroyed Tartarian free energy systems to maintain control over resources and populations. Still others propose that the rewriting of history was orchestrated by secret societies, royal dynasties, or other shadowy organizations seeking to shape the world according to their own vision. But who were the Tartarians themselves? Descriptions vary wildly, but certain themes emerge consistently across different theories. They are portrayed as a technologically advanced people who had mastered forms of energy and engineering that we are only beginning to rediscover today. They are described as builders of impossible architecture, creators of global transportation networks, and possessors of knowledge that integrated science, spirituality, and harmony with natural forces. Some accounts describe the Tartarians as physically different from modern humans, T-lived. Others suggest they were simply older, stronger, and longer humans who had evolved beyond our current limitations, developing abilities and understanding that we have since forgotten. Still others propose that Tartarian and values. The technology attributes civilization included multiple races and species, united not by genetics but by shared knowledge to Tartarian civilization, often argue that many sounds like science fiction, but believers of these supposedly impossible achievements are actually suppressed only by the interests reach of human capability, of those who profit from our current limitations. Free wireless energy transmitted through the atmosphere, buildings that generated their own power through interaction with natural forces, transportation systems that move people and goods across continents without the environmental destruction we associate with modern logistics. Perhaps most intriguingly, Tartarian architecture is often described as living technology, structures that were not merely built but grown, designed to work in harmony with Earth's electromagnetic fields and natural energy systems. The great domed buildings that dot landscapes around the world, from cathedrals, are seen capitol buildings to Kie not as simple architectural choices, but as functional components of a global energy grid that once powered an entire civilization. This brings us to one of the most compelling aspects of the Tartarian mystery. The buildings that believers claim as Tartarian remnants are not random structures scattered haphazardly across the globe. They follow patterns, alignments, and design principles that suggest a coordinated, worldwide architectural program. Domes, spires, and towers positioned at specific intervals and orientations. Star-shaped fortifications that appear on multiple continents with identical designs. Massive stone structures built with techniques that seem to exceed the capabilities of their supposed builders. The Great Pyramids of Egypt, the Taj Mahal in India, the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and countless other monuments are claimed by some Tartarian theorists as products of this lost civilization, not built by the pharaohs, moguls, or founding fathers we learned about in school, but inherited by them from a previous age, their true origins obscured by centuries of historical revision. This global scope is both the most impressive and most controversial aspect of Tartarian theory. If true, it would mean that human civilization once, and technological capability that we have, never achieved a level of coordination communication. It would suggest that the fragmented, competitive world of separate nations and cultures that we take for granted is actually a degraded remnant of something far more unified and advanced. The implications extend beyond architecture and technology into the realm of human potential itself. If Tartarian civilization existed as described, it represents proof that humanity is capable of achievements far beyond what we currently consider possible. It suggests that the problems we struggle with today, energy scarcity, environmental destruction, social perhaps, why Tartarian theory has found such resonance in an inequality and international conflict, are not inevitable aspects of human nature, but obstacles that have been overcome before and could be overcome again. This is age of global uncertainty and technological disruption. It offers hope that current limitations are temporary, that better ways of living have existed and could exist again. It provides, we are usually told, suggesting an alternative narrative to the story of inevitable progress instead, that we may have fallen from greater heights and are only now beginning to climb back toward knowledge and capabilities that our ancestors once possessed. But it also raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of historical knowledge itself. How much of what we think we know about the past is actually accurate? How many of our assumptions about human development, technological progress, and cultural evolution are based on incomplete or deliberately distorted information? And if major civilizations can be erased from history so completely that most people never even hear their names, what does that say about to understand our own past and plan our own future? These questions become even more pressing when we examine the methodology behind historical erasure. The process of removing Tartaria from human memory, if it occurred as theorists suggest, would have required unprecedented coordination across multiple continents and cultures. Consider the logistics alone. Every map would need revision. Every historical document mentioning Tartarian territories, trade routes, or diplomatic relations would require altically suppressed or disglossed empire would need to be systemate. Every local legend that preserved memories of this erasure or destruction. Every oral tradition, every family story in Tartarian civilization argue that this is exactly what happened, and they point to patterns redited. Yet the believers 19th century in our historical record that support their claims. They note was a period of extraordinary historical revision. This was the era when modern archaeology was born, when nationalized education systems began teaching uniform versions of history to museums were established, when standard entire populations. It was also a time of massive social upheaval, industrial transformation, and the emergence of new political orders that claimed legitimacy through carefully constructed narratives about the past. The timing is significant. Just as the last references to Tartaria were disappearing from maps and encyclopedias, the modern world was taking shape. The Industrial Revolution was transforming how people lived and worked. New forms of energy, primarily coal and later oil, were becoming the foundation of economic power. Transportation networks based on railroads and steamships were connecting previously isolated regions. And perhaps most importantly, new systems of education and communication were standardizing what people believed about history, science, and human potential. Tartarian theorists argue that this transformation was not coincidental, but coordinated. They suggest that the same forces driving industrialization also drove the historical revisionism that erased Tartarian civilization from public knowledge. The motivation was control. If people knew that previous civilizations had achieved free energy, global communication, and harmonious social organization, they might question why such achievements seemed impossible in the modern era. They might resist systems that required them to accept scarcity, conflict, and environmental destruction as natural and inevitable. The evidence for this systematic revision extends beyond missing maps and altered documents. Believers point to linguistic clues, noting how words associated with Tartarian culture gradually shifted meaning or disappeared entirely from common usage. They examine archaeological practices, questioning why certain sites receive extensive study while others are ignored or restricted. They analyze architectural restoration projects, suggesting that modifications to historical buildings often obscure rather than preserve evidence of their true origins. Perhaps most tellingly, they point to the treatment of researchers who investigate these topics. Academic careers have been destroyed, they claim, for pursuing questions that challenge accepted historical narratives. Funding disappears for projects that might uncover inconvenient truths. Publications refuse to consider papers that present evidence for alternative historical interpretations. The message, they argue, is clear. Some questions are not meant to be asked, and some possibilities are not meant to be explored. This brings us to the role of institutional authority in shaping historical knowledge. Universities, museums, and educational systems do not simply preserve the past. They actively construct it through the choices they make about what to study, what to display, and what to teach. These institutions, Tartarian believers argue, are not neutral guardians of truth, but active participants in maintaining particular versions of history that serve specific interests. The implications extend far beyond academic debates about ancient civilizations. If major aspects of human history can be systematically suppressed or distorted, what does that mean we trust sources of for our understanding of current events? How can information that may have participated in or inherited the legacy of historical revisionism, and perhaps, most importantly, what other knowledge might be hidden or suppressed that could transform our understanding of human potential and possibility? These questions take on new urgency when we consider the technological capabilities that Tartarian theorists attribute to the lost civilization. The descriptions of free energy systems, for instance, align remarkably with research that modern scientists have pursued, but rarely achieved at practical scales. Wireless power transmission, zero-point energy extraction, and resonance-based technologies all appear in contemporary scientific literature as theoretical possibilities or experimental achievements that have yet to reach widespread implementation. The architectural achievements attributed to Tartarian builders also parallel technologies that modern engineering is only beginning to explore. Structures that generate their own energy through interaction with natural forces. Buildings designed to work with, rather than against, environmental systems. Construction techniques that create seemingly impossible spans and heights without the massive resource expenditure we associate with contemporary megaprojects. Some researchers have attempted to reverse engineer these supposed Tartarian technologies by studying the buildings that believers claim as remnants of the lost civilization. They analyze the positioning of domes and spires, looking for patterns that might indicate energy transmission networks. They examine the materials and construction techniques of historical buildings, searching for evidence of advanced knowledge that exceeds the documented capabilities of their supposed builders. They map the locations of star forts, capitol buildings, and other structures that appear repeatedly across different continents, investigating whether these sites might have served functions beyond their obvious architectural purposes. The results of such investigations are mixed and highly controversial. Mainstream scientists and engineers generally find no evidence for the extraordinary technologies that Tartarian theories propose. They explain apparent anomalies through conventional physics, known historical processes, and the remarkable but entirely human achievements of past builders and craftsmen. But a minority of researchers claim to have identified patterns and phenomena that cannot be easily dismissed through conventional explanations. Electromagnetic measurements around certain historical buildings, for instance, sometimes reveal unexpected field strengths or unusual fluctuations. Acoustic properties of domed structures occasionally demonstrate resonance characteristics that seem to exceed what their documented design would predict. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of areas around suspected Tartarian sites sometimes reveal subsurface structures or patterns that do not match known construction projects or natural geological formations. These findings remain highly disputed, and mainstream science has not accepted them as evidence for lost advanced technologies. But they illustrate how the Tartarian mystery intersects with broader questions about the limits of human achievement and the nature of technological progress itself. Even if the specific claims about Tartarian civilization are incorrect, the questions they raise about suppressed knowledge and hidden capabilities continue to resonate with. The psychological researchers exploring the frontiers of science and engineering appeal of Tartarian theory extends beyond simple curiosity about the past. In an age of environmental crisis, social inequality, and technological disruption, the vision of a lost golden age offers both hope and critique. Hope that humanity has previously achieved the harmony and abundance that seems so elusive today. Critique of current systems that may be preventing us from reclaiming or surpassing those achievements. This appeal helps explain why Tartarian content has found such a massive audience on social media platforms. Videos exploring the theory regularly accumulate millions of views. Online communities dedicated to discussing Tartarian evidence attract tens of thousands of members. The visual nature of the claims, based largely on architectural photographs and historical maps, makes them particularly suited to platforms that prioritize images and short-form content. But the viral spread of Tartarian theory also raises important questions about how historical knowledge is created and validated in the digital age. Traditional gatekeepers of historical information, universities, museums, and academic publishers, operate slowly and cautiously. They require extensive peer review, multiple sources of evidence, and broad consensus before accepting new interpretations of the past. Social media operates on entirely different principles, rewarding content that generates engagement regardless of its accuracy or scholarly rigor. This creates a tension between institutional authority and democratic access to information. On one hand, academic standards exist for good reasons, helping to filter out speculation, bias, and deliberate misinformation. On the other hand, these same standards can become barriers to investigating unconventional possibilities or challenging established narratives. The result is a fragmented landscape of historical knowledge, where different communities operate with fundamentally different assumptions about what constitutes reliable evidence and valid interpretation. The Tartarian phenomenon exemplifies this broader shift in how people relate to expert knowledge and institutional authority. Believers in the lost civilization often express deep skepticism about mainstream historical and scientific institutions, viewing them as compromised by political interests, financial pressures, or simple intellectual rigidity. They turn instead to independent researchers, amateur investigators, and crowdsourced analysis as more trustworthy sources of information. This skepticism is not entirely unfounded. Historical examples abound of institutional science rejecting valid ideas that challenged prevailing orthodoxies. Continental drift, bacterial causes of ulcers, and the existence of meteorites were all dismissed by mainstream science before eventually being accepted. More troubled institutions have sometimes servingly academic, political, and economic interests rather than pure truth-seeking, suppressing research that might threaten powerful constituencies or challenge profitable industries. But the flip side of healthy skepticism is the risk of rejecting all institutional knowledge in favor of theories that feel emotionally satisfying but lack rigorous support. The challenge is developing frameworks for evaluating historical claims that neither blindly accept official narratives nor uncritically embrace alternative theories simply because they challenge mainstream views. This challenge becomes particularly acute when examining the evidence that Tartarian believers present for their claims. Much of this evidence consists of photographs, maps, and documents that are genuine historical artifacts. The buildings they point to as Tartarian remnants really exist. The maps showing Tartarian territories are authentic products of their time periods. The architectural anomalies they highlight, such as partially buried windows and doors, can be observed in cities around the world. The question is not whether this evidence exists, but how to interpret it. Do partially buried architectural elements indicate a massive mud flood that destroyed an advanced civilization? Or do they simply reflect the normal processes of urban development, changing street levels, and practical construction choices? Do the elaborate buildings of world's fairs represent the remnants of Tartarian cities temporarily revealed to the public? Or are they exactly what mainstream history claims? Impressive, but temporary structures built for specific exhibitions and then demolished as planned. These competing interpretations reveal fundamental differences in how people approach historical evidence and construct meaning from incomplete information. The same photograph can tell radically different stories depending on the assumptions and expectations that viewers bring to their analysis. A building with elaborate stonework and impossible engineering feats can be seen as proof of lost advanced technology, or as a testament to the remarkable but entirely human skills of historical craftsmen working with techniques that have since been forgotten or replaced by modern methods. The psychological mechanisms underlying these different interpretations are complex and deeply rooted in how humans process uncertainty and construct coherent worldviews from fragmented information. When faced with historical mysteries or apparent anomalies, our minds naturally seek explanations that fit within our existing frameworks of understanding. For some, this means finding conventional explanations that preserve accepted historical narratives. For others, it means questioning those narratives and exploring possibilities that mainstream institutions have dismissed or ignored. This process is further complicated by the emotional resonance of different explanations. The idea that a golden age civilization once existed and was deliberately destroyed carries powerful psychological appeal for people who feel disappointed or frustrated with current conditions. It transforms present struggles into temporary setbacks rather than inherent limitations. It suggests that the problems we face are not inevitable aspects of human nature, but artificial constraints imposed by systems that benefit from keeping superior knowledge hidden. The emotional power of Tartarian theory becomes even more apparent when we examine how believers describe their personal journeys of discovery. Many report that learning about the supposed lost civilization fundamentally changed how they view the world. They describe feelings of awakening, liberation, and empowerment that come from believing they have accessed hidden truth. They speak of seeing familiar buildings with new eyes, recognizing evidence of advanced technology that had been hiding in plain sight. These personal transformations help explain why Tartarian theory persists despite skepticism from mainstream institutions. For believers, the theory is not simply an abstract historical hypothesis, but a lens that makes sense of their lived experience. It explains why modern architecture often feels cold and soulless compared to the elaborate buildings of previous centuries. It accounts for the sense that current technological progress seems slow and difficult compared to what should be possible. It provides a framework for understanding why so many people feel disconnected from their environment and uncertain about the future. The community aspect of Tartarian belief is equally important. Online forums, social media groups, and video channels dedicated to exploring the theory create spaces where people can share discoveries, debate interpretations, and support each other's investigations. These communities often develop their own standards of evidence, methods of analysis, and systems of peer review that operate independently of academic institutions. Within these communities, contributors gain recognition and status through their ability to identify new examples of supposed Tartarian architecture, decode hidden symbols and meanings, or connect disparate pieces of evidence into coherent narratives. The collaborative nature of this research creates a sense of participation in important discovery that many people find lacking in their daily lives. Rather than passively consuming information produced by distant experts, they become active investigators, contributing to the collective understanding of hidden history. This participatory element helps explain why Tartarian theory has proven particularly successful in the digital age. Social media platforms provide tools that make it easy for amateur researchers to share their findings with global audiences. High-quality cameras allow anyone to document architectural details that might have gone unnoticed in previous eras. Digital archives make historical maps and documents accessible to people who previously would have had no way to examine such materials. The democratization of research tools has genuine benefits, allowing insights and observations that might be missed by traditional academic gatekeepers. But it also creates challenges in distinguishing between valid discoveries and misinterpreted evidence. Without the checks and balances of institutional peer review, online communities can sometimes amplify errors, confirm biases, and build elaborate theories on foundations that cannot support their weight. The Tartarian phenomenon also intersects with broader cultural anxieties about technological progress and human agency. In an era when artificial intelligence threatens to automate human jobs, when climate change seems to outpace our ability to respond, and when social media algorithms shape our perceptions of reality, the vision of a lost civilization that had mastered these challenges carries special appeal. The technologies attributed to Tartarian civilization, free energy, harmonious architecture, global communication networks without environmental destruction represent solutions to problems that feel increasingly urgent and intractable today. If such solutions once existed, their rediscovery becomes not just historically interesting, but practically essential for human survival and flourishing. This urgency helps explain why some Tartarian researchers focus not just on documenting evidence for the lost civilization, but on attempting to reverse engineer its supposed technologies. They analyze the proportions and positioning of domed buildings, looking for mathematical relationships that might indicate energy transmission principles. They study the acoustic properties of historical structures, searching for resonance patterns that could be applied to modern energy generation. They examine the materials and construction techniques of ancient buildings, hoping to rediscover lost knowledge that could revolutionize contemporary architecture and engineering. These practical applications remain highly speculative, and mainstream science has found no evidence that historical buildings possess the extraordinary capabilities that Tartarian theory attributes to them. But the effort to extract useful knowledge from alternative historical interpretations reflects a broader hunger for technological solutions that current institutions seem unable or unwilling to provide. The environmental implications of Tartarian theory are particularly striking. At a time when industrial civilization faces mounting evidence of its unsustainability, the vision of a previous society that achieved advanced technology without environmental destruction offers both inspiration and critique. If Tartarians really did power their civilization through free energy extracted from natural forces, if they really did build in harmony with rather than opposition to ecological systems, then current approaches to energy and development represent not inevitable trade-offs, but poor choices that could be corrected through recovered wisdom. This environmental angle helps explain why Tartarian theory has found audiences not just among conspiracy theorists and alternative historians, but also among people concerned about sustainability and climate change. The idea that solutions to environmental crisis once existed but were suppressed provides hope that such solutions could be rediscovered and implemented before it is too late to prevent ecological collapse. The agricultural implications are equally compelling. Some Tartarian researchers claim that the lost civilization practiced forms of farming that enhanced rather than depleted soil health, that worked with natural cycles rather than against them, and that produced abundance without the chemical inputs and genetic modifications that characterize modern agriculture. These claims align with growing concerns about the sustainability of industrial farming and the need for agricultural methods that can feed growing populations without destroying the ecosystems on which food production ultimately depends. The social and political dimensions of Tartarian theory are perhaps the most controversial and far-reaching. If a global civilization once existed that maintained peace and prosperity across vast distances and diverse populations, what does that suggest about the possibility of overcoming current divisions and conflicts? If Tartarian society really did achieve harmony between different cultures and regions, then contemporary nationalism, tribalism, and international competition might represent artificial barriers rather than natural human tendencies. This global perspective challenges fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization that underlie current political and economic systems. It suggests that cooperation might be more natural than competition, that diversity might be a source of strength rather than division, and that peaceful coordination might be achievable on scales that current institutions consider impossible. But it also raises difficult questions about how such coordination might be achieved and maintained. If Tartarian civilization was as advanced and harmonious as believers claim, why did it fall? What vulnerabilities or contradictions allowed such a powerful society to be destroyed or to destroy itself? And what lessons from its collapse might be relevant for preventing similar disasters in our own time? Different versions of Tartarian theory offer different answers to these questions. Some emphasize natural disasters, suggesting that climate change, geological catastrophes, or cosmic events overwhelmed even advanced Tartarian technology. Others focus on deliberate destruction, proposing that rival civilizations or internal conflicts led to wars that devastated Tartarian society. Still others suggest that the civilization did not fall, but was deliberately hidden, its knowledge preserved by secret societies or underground networks that continue to operate today. Each explanation carries different implications for contemporary action. If natural disasters destroyed Tartarian civilization, then developing resilience against similar threats becomes a priority. If deliberate destruction was the cause, then identifying and countering forces that might repeat such actions becomes essential. If the civilization was hidden rather than destroyed, then the task becomes finding and reconnecting with sources of preserved knowledge. The search for such knowledge has led some Tartarian researchers to examine not just buildings and maps, but also cultural traditions, religious practices, and indigenous knowledge systems that might preserve fragments of lost wisdom. They look for common symbols, architectural principles, and technological concepts that appear across different cultures, suggesting shared origins in a more unified past. They study ancient texts and oral traditions for references to global civilizations, advanced technologies, or great catastrophes that might correspond to Tartarian history. This cross-cultural approach has produced some intriguing observations. Similar architectural styles, mathematical principles, and symbolic systems do appear in cultures that are supposed to have developed independently. Star-shaped fortifications, domed buildings, and precise stone construction techniques show up on multiple continents in time periods when such cultures are not believed to have had contact with each other. These patterns could indicate common human responses to similar challenges, independent invention of effective solutions, or more contact between ancient civilizations than mainstream history acknowledges. but Tartarian believers interpret them as evidence for a shared global heritage that has been fragmented and disguised through deliberate historical revision. The linguistic evidence for Tartarian connections is particularly intriguing to some researchers. They point to similarities in place names, architectural terms, and cultural concepts that appear across vast geographic distances. Words related to star patterns, energy principles, and building techniques sometimes show unexpected similarities between languages that are not supposed to be related. These patterns could reflect ancient trade relationships, migration patterns, or cultural exchange that mainstream linguistics has not fully recognized. But language is also where some of the most problematic aspects of Tartarian theory become apparent. The etymological connections that believers identify often rely on superficial sound similarities rather than rigorous linguistic analysis. The supposed global language or communication system of Tartarian civilization remains vague and undefined, with different researchers proposing incompatible theories about how it might have functioned. This vagueness extends to many aspects of Tartarian theory. While believers are confident that the lost civilization possessed advanced technology and global reach, they struggle to provide specific, testable details about how Tartarian society actually functioned. What were their political systems? How did they organize labor and resources? What were their cultural values and religious beliefs? How did they maintain communication and coordination across such vast territories? The lack of concrete details makes Tartarian theory difficult to evaluate using standard historical methods. Without specific claims that can be tested against archaeological evidence or historical records, the theory exists more as a general framework for interpreting anomalies than as a precise description of past events. This flexibility allows believers to incorporate new evidence and adapt to challenges, but it also makes the theory resistant to definitive refutation. This resistance to refutation is both a strength and a weakness of Tartarian theory. It allows the framework to survive encounters with contrary evidence by reinterpreting that evidence or expanding the scope of the supposed conspiracy. But it also makes the theory less useful for generating specific predictions or practical applications. If Tartarian technology was so advanced, why has no one been able to successfully reverse engineer it? If Tartarian knowledge was preserved by secret societies, why has none of it been demonstrated under controlled conditions? These questions highlight the difference between theories that inspire imagination and theories that generate actionable knowledge. Tartarian theory clearly succeeds at the former, providing a compelling alternative narrative that challenges mainstream assumptions and encourages people to look at familiar evidence with fresh eyes. Whether it succeeds at the latter remains hotly debated, with believers claiming ongoing discoveries and skeptics finding no reliable applications. The debate over practical applications reflects broader tensions about the relationship between alternative theories and established institutions. Tartarian believers often express frustration that mainstream science and academia refuse to seriously investigate their claims. They argue that institutional bias, financial interests, and intellectual rigidity prevent proper evaluation of evidence for lost advanced technology. Mainstream researchers respond that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that Tartarian proponents have not met the burden of proof required for acceptance of such radical historical revisions. They point to the lack of peer-reviewed research, the absence of archaeological evidence that clearly supports Tartarian claims, and the tendency of believers to reject conventional explanations without providing superior alternatives. This standoff reflects deeper disagreements about how knowledge should be validated and who has the authority to determine what counts as legitimate evidence. In an age when traditional institutions face declining trust and alternative sources of information proliferate online, these disagreements have implications that extend far beyond debates about historical architecture and lost civilizations. The methodology behind these competing knowledge systems reveals fundamental questions about how we determine truth from evidence. When Tartarian researchers examine a photograph of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, they see architectural achievements that seem impossible for temporary structures built in months and demolished within a year. The precision of the stonework, the elaborate facades, the sheer scale of construction appear to exceed what should have been feasible with the time, budget, and technology officially allocated to the project. Mainstream historians counter with documentation showing exactly how these structures were built, using a material called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber applied over wooden frames. They point to contemporary accounts describing the construction process, financial records showing payments to workers and suppliers, and photographs documenting the demolition. To them, the explanation is straightforward. Skilled craftsmen using established techniques created impressive but temporary buildings designed to last only for the duration of the exhibition. But Tartarian believers see something different in this same evidence. They question whether the documentation might have been created after the fact to provide cover stories for structures that were actually much older. They point to inconsistencies in the official timeline, noting that construction seemed to proceed impossibly quickly for such elaborate buildings. They analyze the photographs more closely, claiming to identify architectural details and construction techniques that exceed what staff construction should have been able to achieve. The photographs themselves become contested territory. Images showing empty streets and completed buildings are interpreted by Tartarian researchers as evidence that these were abandoned cities being temporarily reopened rather than new constructions being unveiled. The absence of crowds during certain photographic sessions suggests to them that the sites were not actually bustling construction projects, but recently discovered ruins being documented before their planned destruction. Mainstream historians explain the empty streets differently. Photography in the 1890s required long exposure times that would blur moving people and vehicles. Many photographs were taken during early morning hours or between scheduled events specifically to capture architectural details without distracting crowds. The logistics of coordinating thousands of workers and visitors would naturally create periods when areas appeared empty despite ongoing activity. These competing interpretations reveal how the same physical evidence can support radically different conclusions depending on the framework used to analyze it. Neither side is simply making up their evidence. Both are working with genuine historical artifacts, real photographs, and documented accounts. The difference lies in which pieces of evidence are emphasized, which are dismissed, and how the gaps between documented facts are filled in. This pattern repeats across the broader landscape of Tartarian claims. When believers point to similarities between buildings on different continents, they see evidence of a coordinated global civilization. When mainstream historians examine the same buildings, they see parallel evolution, cultural exchange through trade routes, or the spread of popular architectural styles through normal historical processes. The star forts that appear across Europe, North America, and other regions become focal points for this interpretive divide. Tartarian researchers note the mathematical precision of these structures, their strategic positioning, and the apparent coordination of their construction across vast distances. They argue that such consistency could only result from centralized planning by a global civilization with advanced engineering knowledge. Military historians offer different explanations. The star fort design, they note, was developed in response to the introduction of gunpowder weapons in warfare. The angular bastions and sloped walls were specifically engineered to deflect cannon fire and eliminate blind spots that attackers could exploit. The similarity of designs across different regions reflects the rapid spread of military technology and engineering knowledge as European powers competed for colonial dominance. The timing of star fort construction aligns with this conventional explanation. Most examples date from the 16th through 18th centuries, coinciding with the period when European nations were establishing global trade networks and colonial empires. The knowledge and resources required to build these fortifications would have traveled along the same routes that carried other forms of military and architectural innovation. But Tartarian believers question this timeline, arguing that the conventional dating methods used to establish construction periods are unreliable or have been deliberately falsified. They point to examples where official construction dates seem inconsistent with other evidence, where architectural styles appear to predate their supposed origins, or where the logistics of conventional construction seem implausible given documented historical conditions. This skepticism toward dating methods extends to scientific techniques like radiocarbon analysis and dendrochronology. Some Tartarian researchers claim these methods have been compromised by institutional bias or are simply less reliable than mainstream science acknowledges. Others propose that global catastrophes like the supposed mud floods could have contaminated samples or altered the environmental conditions that these techniques rely on for accuracy. Mainstream scientists respond that multiple independent dating methods consistently support conventional historical timelines. Radiocarbon dates from organic materials, tree ring patterns, thermoluminescence from ceramics, and other techniques regularly cross-validate each other. The systematic errors that would be required to produce false ancient dates across multiple methods and multiple laboratories would require coordination on a scale that seems implausible. The debate over dating methods illustrates a broader epistemological divide between Tartarian believers and mainstream academia. At stake is not just the age of particular buildings or artifacts, but the fundamental question of how we can reliably determine truth about the past. If scientific methods are unreliable or compromised, then alternative approaches to evidence evaluation become necessary. If traditional academic institutions cannot be trusted, then new forms of peer review and knowledge validation must be developed. This challenge to institutional authority resonates with broader cultural trends toward decentralization and democratization of knowledge production. The Internet has made it possible for anyone to access historical documents, analyze photographs, and share research findings with global audiences. Crowdsourced investigation can sometimes identify patterns or anomalies that professional researchers miss, either because they lack the time to examine every detail or because their training creates blind spots that prevent them from seeing certain possibilities. The success of citizen science projects in fields like astronomy and biology demonstrates that amateur researchers can make genuine contributions to human knowledge. Online communities have discovered new galaxies, tracked disease outbreaks, and solved complex protein folding problems that had stumped professional scientists. The same technological tools that enable these successes also make it possible for groups of dedicated amateurs to conduct detailed analysis of historical evidence. Tartarian research communities exemplify both the potential and the pitfalls of this democratized approach to knowledge production. On one hand, their collective efforts have documented architectural details, historical maps, and cultural patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed. They have created comprehensive databases of buildings that exhibit similar design principles across different continents and time periods. They have preserved and digitized historical documents that provide context for understanding past civilizations and their achievements. On the other hand, the same communities sometimes amplify errors, confirm biases, and build elaborate theories on foundations that cannot support their weight. Without the checks and balances of institutional peer review, speculation can be presented as fact. Correlations can be mistaken for causation, and dramatic conclusions can be drawn from limited evidence. The challenge becomes distinguishing between genuine insights and compelling fiction. When Tartarian researchers identify mathematical relationships in the positioning of historical buildings, are they revealing evidence of advanced ancient knowledge or finding patterns that exist primarily in their own minds? When they point to similarities between structures on different continents, are they documenting proof of global civilization or highlighting coincidences that seem significant only because of selective attention to certain features while ignoring others? These questions become particularly acute when examining the technological claims associated with Tartarian theory. The assertion that historical buildings functioned as energy generation and transmission systems is difficult to evaluate using conventional scientific methods. If such technologies worked on principles that current science does not recognize or understand, then the absence of measurable effects under controlled conditions might not disprove their existence. Some researchers have attempted to test these claims by measuring electromagnetic fields around buildings that Tartarian believers identify as former energy nodes. Results have been mixed and controversial. Conventional measurements sometimes reveal unusual field strengths or patterns, but these can usually be explained by natural geological features, modern electrical systems, or measurement artifacts, rather than ancient technology. More sophisticated attempts to detect Tartarian energy systems have used ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and other geophysical techniques to map subsurface structures around suspect sites. These surveys occasionally reveal underground chambers, tunnels, or other features that do not appear in conventional architectural records. But the interpretation of such discoveries remains contentious, with mainstream archaeologists generally finding conventional explanations, while Tartarian researchers see evidence of hidden infrastructure. The acoustic properties of domed buildings provide another avenue for testing technological claims. Some researchers have documented unusual resonance characteristics in structures that Tartarian theory identifies as energy facilities. These buildings sometimes exhibit sound focusing effects, harmonic amplification, or other acoustic phenomena that seem to exceed what their documented design should produce. Conventional explanations for such effects usually invoke the mathematical relationships inherent in dome construction, the acoustic properties of stone and other building materials, or the influence of architectural details that may not be apparent in casual observation. But some acoustic researchers acknowledge that certain historical buildings demonstrate sound characteristics that are not fully understood or easily replicated with modern construction techniques. The gap between what can be measured and what can be explained creates space for alternative interpretations to flourish. When conventional science cannot provide complete explanations for observed phenomena, theories like Tartarian advanced technology become more plausible to people who are already skeptical of mainstream institutions. This dynamic reflects broader tensions between reductionist and holistic approaches to understanding complex systems. Conventional science excels at analyzing isolated variables under controlled conditions, but it sometimes struggles to account for emergent properties that arise from the interaction of multiple factors. Historical buildings represent exactly this kind of complex system, where architectural design, construction materials, environmental conditions, and human use patterns combine to create effects that may not be predictable from studying individual components. Tartarian theory appeals to people who favor holistic thinking and who suspect that reductionist approaches may be missing important aspects of how complex systems actually function. The vision of buildings that work as integrated components of larger energy networks, that respond to natural forces in ways that enhance rather than resist environmental systems, that create beneficial effects through harmony rather than domination, aligns with holistic values and perspectives. The environmental implications of this holistic vision extend beyond questions of ancient technology into contemporary concerns about sustainability and ecological balance. At a time when conventional construction methods are recognized as major contributors to climate change, resource depletion, and environmental degradation, the possibility that previous civilizations developed more harmonious approaches to building and energy use carries urgent practical significance. Some contemporary architects and engineers have attempted to apply principles derived from Tartarian research to modern construction projects. These efforts usually focus on passive energy design, natural ventilation systems, acoustic optimization, and integration with local environmental conditions, rather than on reproducing supposed free energy technologies. The results of such experiments are encouraging, but limited. Buildings designed according to principles inspired by Tartarian theory sometimes demonstrate improved energy efficiency, better acoustic properties, and enhanced occupant comfort compared to conventional construction. But they have not produced the revolutionary breakthroughs that would validate the more extraordinary technological claims associated with the lost civilization. This gap between inspiration and application highlights one of the persistent challenges facing alternative historical theories. Even if such theories contain valuable insights about human potential and technological possibility, translating those insights into practical applications requires bridging the divide between speculation and rigorous testing. The process of moving from interesting ideas to reliable technology demands exactly the kind of systematic investigation and peer review that alternative research communities often reject as compromised or biased. The social implications of Tartarian theory extend beyond questions of technology and architecture into fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. If a global civilization once maintained peace and cooperation across vast distances and diverse populations, then current divisions between nations, cultures, and ideologies might represent artificial barriers rather than natural human tendencies. This perspective challenges the competitive individualism and nationalist thinking that characterize much of contemporary politics and economics. It suggests that cooperation might be more natural than competition, that diversity might be a source of strength rather than conflict, and that global coordination might be achievable on scales that current institutions consider impossible. The practical implications of this social vision are both inspiring and daunting. If Tartarian civilization really did achieve harmony between different regions and cultures, then overcoming contemporary divisions might be possible through recovered wisdom and renewed commitment to cooperative values. But if such a civilization existed and then fell, what vulnerabilities or contradictions allowed its destruction? And what lessons from its collapse might be essential for preventing similar disasters in our own time? Different interpretations of Tartarian history offer different answers to these crucial questions. Some emphasize external threats, suggesting that natural disasters or hostile forces overwhelmed even advanced Tartarian technology and social organization. Others focus on internal contradictions, proposing that the civilization contained the seeds of its own destruction through unsustainable practices, social inequalities, or cultural conflicts. Still others suggest that Tartarian civilization did not truly fall, but was deliberately hidden or transformed by groups that wanted to control its knowledge and technology for their own purposes. This interpretation implies that the wisdom and capabilities of the lost civilization might still exist in some form, preserved by secret societies, indigenous communities, or other guardians who have maintained ancient knowledge through generations of persecution and suppression. The search for such preserved knowledge has led some Tartarian researchers to examine not just physical artifacts, but also cultural traditions, religious practices, and indigenous wisdom systems that might contain fragments of lost understanding. They look for common symbols, mathematical principles, and technological concepts that appear across different cultures, suggesting shared origins in a more unified past. This cross-cultural approach has produced some thought-provoking observations about patterns that appear in societies around the world. Similar architectural proportions, symbolic systems, and mathematical relationships show up in cultures that mainstream history considers to have developed independently. These patterns could indicate universal human responses to common challenges, but they could also suggest more connection between ancient civilizations than conventional scholarship acknowledges. The investigation of cultural patterns leads naturally into questions about consciousness, spirituality, and the non-material aspects of human experience that might have been more developed in Tartarian civilization. Some researchers propose that the lost empire achieved its technological and social breakthroughs through enhanced understanding of consciousness, energy fields, and the subtle forces that connect human beings with each other and with their environment. These claims venture into territory that conventional science approaches with extreme caution. The measurement and verification of consciousness-related phenomena presents challenges that exceed even those involved in testing claims about ancient technology. Subjective experiences, subtle energies, and non-local connections between minds and environments resist the controlled experimental methods that form the foundation of mainstream scientific investigation. Yet some contemporary research in fields like quantum physics, consciousness studies, and environmental psychology has begun to document phenomena that were previously dismissed as impossible or irrelevant. Quantum entanglement demonstrates that particles can maintain instantaneous connections across vast distances. Studies of meditation and other consciousness practices reveal measurable changes in brain activity, immune function, and even gene expression. Research on environmental psychology shows that architectural design and natural settings significantly influence human behavior, creativity, and well-being. These developments create new contexts for evaluating claims about Tartarian consciousness technology and the integration of human awareness with architectural and environmental systems. While extraordinary claims still require extraordinary evidence, the boundaries of what counts as possible or plausible continue to shift as scientific understanding evolves. The implications extend beyond academic debates into practical questions about how human beings might organize themselves and their technologies to create sustainable and fulfilling civilizations. If consciousness and environmental harmony played important roles in Tartarian achievements, then recovering or developing similar capabilities might be essential for addressing contemporary challenges. This practical orientation helps explain why Tartarian theory attracts not just history enthusiasts, but also people working on contemporary problems in architecture, energy, agriculture, and social organization. The vision of a civilization that achieved abundance without destruction, cooperation without oppression, and technology without alienation provides inspiration for anyone seeking alternatives to current systems that seem increasingly unsustainable and inadequate. The challenge lies in distinguishing between useful insights and wishful thinking. The appeal of Tartarian theory as a source of hope and alternative vision is undeniable, but hope alone is not sufficient for creating positive change. The practical work of developing better technologies, more sustainable systems, and more cooperative social structures requires rigorous investigation, careful testing, and willingness to learn from both successes and failures. This tension between inspiration and application reflects broader challenges facing anyone who seeks to create significant positive change in complex systems. Revolutionary breakthroughs are always possible, but they usually emerge from patient accumulation of knowledge, gradual refinement of techniques, and persistent effort to overcome obstacles, rather than from sudden revelations or recovered ancient wisdom. The story of Tartarian theory thus becomes not just a debate about historical facts, but a lens for examining how human beings relate to knowledge, authority, possibility, and change. Whether or not an advanced global civilization once existed and was deliberately erased from history, the questions raised by Tartarian research touch on fundamental issues that every generation must address anew. How do we determine what is true when different sources of authority provide conflicting information? How do we balance healthy skepticism with openness to new possibilities? How do we distinguish between genuine insights and appealing fantasies? How do we translate inspiration into effective action? How do we create institutions that preserve valuable knowledge while remaining open to discovery and change? These questions take on special urgency in an age when traditional sources of authority face declining trust, when information proliferates faster than our ability to verify its accuracy, and when global challenges require unprecedented cooperation and innovation. The skills needed to navigate this landscape, critical thinking, collaborative investigation, integration of multiple perspectives, and practical application of insights, are the same skills needed to evaluate claims about lost civilizations and hidden history. In this sense, Tartarian theory serves as a training ground for developing the intellectual and social capabilities that contemporary challenges demand. Whether believers ultimately prove correct about the existence of an advanced lost civilization, the process of investigating their claims provides valuable practice in evidence evaluation, community building, and the integration of alternative perspectives with established knowledge. The ongoing evolution of Tartarian research also demonstrates how ideas and communities adapt and change in response to new information and changing circumstances. Early versions of the theory focused primarily on Russian nationalism and alternative chronologies. Contemporary versions emphasize global architecture and suppress technology. Future developments may incorporate new discoveries, respond to criticism, or evolve in directions that current participants cannot predict. This evolutionary quality suggests that Tartarian theory, like other alternative historical frameworks, functions less as a fixed doctrine than as a dynamic process of exploration and meaning-making. Its value may lie not in providing definitive answers about the past, but in keeping alive questions about human potential, institutional authority, and the possibilities for creating better futures. The conversation between Tartarian believers and mainstream historians also illustrates how knowledge advances through dialogue between different perspectives, even when those perspectives seem incompatible. Each side challenges the other to examine assumptions, refine methods, and articulate more clearly the basis for their conclusions. The result may not be consensus, but it often leads to better understanding of the complexities and limitations involved in reconstructing the past. As night settles around us and these questions continue to unfold, we find ourselves not with definitive answers, but with deeper appreciation for the mysteries that surround human history and potential. Whether Tartaria existed as its believers claim, whether advanced civilizations have been erased from our understanding, whether current limitations are temporary obstacles or permanent constraints, remains uncertain. What is certain is that the search for these answers reveals as much about our present hopes and fears as it does about any possible past. The investigation continues, carried forward by communities of researchers who refuse to accept that all important questions have been answered, that all significant discoveries have been made, or that the story of human civilization is as simple as our textbooks suggest. In their persistence, their willingness to question authority, and their determination to examine evidence that others dismiss, they embody qualities that have always driven human progress, regardless of whether their specific conclusions prove correct. And in that persistence, that questioning, that determination, we might find something more valuable than proof of any particular historical claim. We might find renewed confidence in our own capacity to investigate, to wonder, and to imagine possibilities that extend beyond the boundaries of what we currently know or accept as real. The mystery of Tartaria continues to unfold, not just in the evidence and arguments of its investigators, but in the minds and communities of everyone who encounters these ideas and must decide for themselves what to make of them. In that ongoing decision, in that personal engagement with questions that have no easy answers, the real exploration begins. As we move deeper into this labyrinth of hidden history, we encounter something that challenges everything we think we know about how civilizations develop and disappear. The more we examine the evidence that Tartarian researchers present, the more we realize that their investigation has uncovered patterns that extend far beyond simple questions of architecture or ancient empires. What they have found touches something fundamental about the nature of knowledge itself, about how information is preserved or destroyed, and about the mechanisms that determine what each generation learns about those who came before. Consider for a moment the sheer logistics involved in erasing an entire civilization from human memory. We are not talking about hiding a single building or suppressing a single document. We are talking about coordinating the systematic removal of references across multiple continents, multiple languages, and multiple centuries. Every map would need to be redrawn. Every encyclopedia would require revision. Every local tradition that preserved memories of the lost empire would need to be systematically discouraged or destroyed. Every family story that passed down knowledge of different times would need to be dismissed as fantasy or superstition. The scale of such an operation would require resources and coordination that dwarf even the most ambitious projects undertaken by modern governments or international organizations. Yet Tartarian believers argue that this is exactly what occurred, and they point to historical precedents that suggest such massive revisions of collective memory are not only possible, but have occurred repeatedly throughout human history. The burning of libraries, they note, has been a consistent feature of conquest and cultural transformation. The Library of Alexandria, the destruction of Mayan codices by Spanish conquistadors, the systematic elimination of indigenous knowledge systems during colonial expansion, all demonstrate that entire bodies of knowledge can disappear within generations when those in power decide that such information threatens their interests or contradicts their preferred narratives. What makes the supposed Tartarian erasure different is not its methods, but its scale and thoroughness. Rather than simply destroying inconvenient documents or suppressing rival interpretations, the alleged conspiracy involved creating entirely new historical narratives that filled the gaps left by the removed information. This required not just destruction, but construction, the active creation of alternative explanations that could account for the evidence that remained while directing attention away from questions that might reveal what had been hidden. The process, according to Tartarian researchers, involved multiple stages spread across several centuries. First came the physical destruction of the empire itself through natural disasters, engineered catastrophes, or systematic warfare designed to eliminate not just the population, but the infrastructure that supported their civilization. Next came the immediate aftermath, during which survivors were scattered, relocated, or absorbed into other populations, where their distinct cultural identity would gradually fade. The third stage involved the systematic collection and destruction of written records, maps, and artifacts that documented the empire's existence. This phase required identifying and accessing repositories of information across vast geographic areas, a task that could only be accomplished by organizations with global reach and substantial resources. Religious institutions, trading networks, and emerging governmental bureaucracies all had the infrastructure necessary to locate and eliminate specific types of documents on an international scale. The fourth stage was perhaps the most sophisticated, involving the creation of replacement historical narratives that could explain the same geographical areas, architectural remains, and cultural patterns that had previously been attributed to the lost empire. This required not just imagination, but detailed knowledge of the evidence that needed to be accounted for. The new stories had to be plausible enough to satisfy scholars and detailed enough to withstand casual investigation. Finally came the longest and most subtle phase, the gradual institutionalization of the new historical narratives through educational systems, academic institutions, and cultural traditions that would ensure each successive generation learned the replacement version rather than the original truth. This phase could only succeed if the institutions responsible for preserving and transmitting knowledge were either complicit in the deception or had themselves been deceived by earlier stages of the process. The psychological mechanisms that would make such a comprehensive deception possible are well documented in research on memory, belief formation, and social influence. Individuals and communities regularly reconstruct their understanding of past events based on new information, social pressure, and changing circumstances. What seems impossible is not that people could be convinced to accept new versions of history, but that such revisions could be coordinated across the scale that Tartarian erasure would require. Yet when we examine the institutions that were developing during the period when Tartarian references were disappearing from historical records, we find organizations that possessed exactly the characteristics necessary for such coordination. The period from the 16th through the 19th centuries saw the emergence of global trading companies with unprecedented reach and resources. Religious organizations developed missionary networks that spanned continents and maintained communication across vast distances. Military and colonial administrations created bureaucratic systems capable of implementing uniform policies across diverse populations and geographic regions. More significantly, this was the period when modern systems of education, scholarship, and information distribution were taking shape. Universities standardized their curricula and methods. Publishing houses centralized the production and distribution of books and periodicals. Museums and libraries established protocols for collecting, cataloging, and preserving cultural artifacts and documents. National governments began creating official histories and educational standards that determined what their citizens would learn about the past. The concentration of authority over information that occurred during this period created both the opportunity and the infrastructure necessary for large-scale historical revision. For the first time in human history, relatively small numbers of people in positions of institutional authority could influence what millions of people believed about the past. The same systems that enabled the preservation and transmission of knowledge also made it possible to suppress or alter that knowledge according to the interests of those who controlled the institutions. Tartarian researchers argue that this concentration of authority was not coincidental but deliberate, designed specifically to facilitate the erasure of inconvenient historical truths and the establishment of narratives that supported emerging power structures. They point to the timing of institutional development, noting how universities, museums, and educational systems were often established or reformed during the same periods when references to Tartarian territories were disappearing from official sources. The motivations for such a massive deception, according to different versions of Tartarian theory, varied depending on who was behind it and what they hoped to accomplish. Some accounts emphasize religious motivations, suggesting that Tartarian civilization possessed spiritual knowledge or practices that threatened established religious hierarchies. The integration of advanced technology with spiritual understanding might have demonstrated possibilities for human development that contradicted doctrines about human limitation and dependence on religious institutions. Other interpretations focus on economic motivations, proposing that Tartarian energy technologies and resource management systems threatened the emerging industrial order that was based on scarcity, competition, and centralized control over energy sources. If free energy systems and sustainable abundance were possible, then the entire foundation of industrial capitalism would be undermined. Those who profited from controlling access to coal, oil, and other energy sources would have powerful incentives to suppress knowledge of alternatives. Political motivations provide another explanatory framework. If Tartarian civilization had achieved peaceful coordination across vast territories and diverse populations, its example might have inspired resistance to the emerging system of competing nation-states that was being established through European colonial expansion. The vision of global cooperation and shared prosperity could have threatened the divide and control strategies that enabled relatively small populations in Europe to dominate much larger populations in other regions. Still, other accounts propose that the erasure of Tartarian history was motivated by simple fear of human potential. If people learned that previous civilizations had achieved capabilities far beyond what current institutions considered possible, they might begin to question the limitations that were presented as natural and inevitable. They might demand access to technologies that had been suppressed. They might organize themselves according to principles that had been demonstrated to work on scales larger than anything current political systems could manage. The fear-based interpretation suggests that the erasure of Tartarian civilization was less about specific threats to particular interests and more about maintaining general control over human imagination and aspiration. By ensuring that people believed they were the first to achieve significant technological and social development, those in power could position themselves as the pinnacle of human progress, rather than as inferior inheritors of greater achievements. This psychological dimension of the alleged conspiracy extends beyond simple information control into the realm of identity and meaning. The stories that people tell about their origins and development shape not just their understanding of the past, but their expectations for the future. If human civilization is portrayed as a steady climb from primitive beginnings toward greater achievements, then current limitations appear temporary and future progress seems inevitable. But if human civilization is portrayed as cyclical, with previous peaks and valleys that dwarf contemporary achievements, then current limitations might represent not temporary obstacles, but degradation from superior conditions that once existed. The implications for individual and collective self-concept are profound. Are we pioneers pushing into uncharted territory, or are we refugees struggling to recover from catastrophic loss? The answer to this question affects everything from personal motivation and social organization to technological development and environmental policy. People who see themselves as pioneers are likely to approach challenges differently than people who see themselves as refugees. Societies that believe they are climbing toward unprecedented achievements may make different choices than societies that believe they are trying to recover from civilizational collapse. Tartarian theory forces this fundamental question into the open by claiming that we are indeed refugees from a greater past rather than pioneers toward a greater future. The implications extend beyond historical curiosity into practical questions about how we should organize our efforts to create positive change. Should we focus on innovation and discovery, pushing into genuinely new territory? Or should we focus on recovery and restoration, trying to regain capabilities that have been lost? The question becomes even more complex when we consider the possibility that both perspectives might be partially correct. Perhaps human development is neither purely linear nor purely cyclical, but involves elements of both progression and regression, innovation and recovery, building on past achievements while also transcending previous limitations. This more nuanced view allows for the possibility that Tartarian civilization, if it existed, might have achieved genuine advances in some areas while remaining limited in others. Their supposed mastery of energy and architecture might have coexisted with vulnerabilities or blind spots that eventually led to their downfall. Their global coordination might have required trade-offs or compromises that contain the seeds of future problems. From this perspective, the task becomes not simply recovering lost Tartarian knowledge, but learning from both their achievements and their failures. What made their successes possible? What prevented those successes from being sustained? How can contemporary civilization build on their strengths while avoiding their weaknesses? These questions require moving beyond simple admiration or rejection of Tartarian claims toward more sophisticated analysis of what different civilizational approaches might offer. Even if the specific details of Tartarian theory prove incorrect, the questions it raises about human potential, institutional authority, and civilizational design remain relevant for anyone interested in creating positive change. The process of investigating these questions also demonstrates important principles about how knowledge develops and how communities of inquiry function. Tartarian research communities have developed their own methods for evaluating evidence, their own standards for peer review, and their own criteria for distinguishing between reliable and unreliable information. These alternative knowledge systems operate according to different assumptions than mainstream academic institutions, but they follow recognizable patterns of collective investigation and meaning-making. The success of these alternative systems in attracting participants and generating ongoing research demonstrates that significant numbers of people feel excluded from or dissatisfied with conventional approaches to historical and scientific investigation. Whether their dissatisfaction is justified or misguided, it reflects broader tensions about who has the authority to determine what counts as legitimate knowledge and how that authority should be exercised. The democratization of research tools through digital technology has made it possible for amateur investigators to conduct analyses that were previously restricted to professional scholars, with access to specialized libraries and laboratories. High-resolution photography allows detailed examination of architectural features. Satellite imagery provides new perspectives on landscape patterns and site relationships. Digital archives make historical documents accessible to global audiences. These technological developments have genuine benefits, enabling discoveries and insights that might be missed by traditional gatekeepers of knowledge. But they also create challenges in distinguishing between valid contributions and misinterpreted evidence. The same tools that enable legitimate amateur research also make it easier to build elaborate theories on insufficient foundations. The Tartarian phenomenon illustrates both the potential and the pitfalls of democratized research. The collective efforts of online communities have documented architectural details, historical patterns, and cultural connections that might otherwise go unnoticed. They have preserved and digitized materials that provide valuable resources for future investigation. They have demonstrated that passionate amateurs can sometimes identify questions and evidence that professional scholars overlook. At the same time, these communities sometimes amplify errors, confirm biases, and resist correction when their conclusions are challenged by contrary evidence. The collaborative enthusiasm that drives their investigations can also make them resistant to the kind of rigorous skepticism that helps distinguish between genuine discoveries and compelling fantasies. The challenge for anyone interested in learning from Tartarian research lies in separating potentially valuable insights from demonstrably false claims. This requires developing skills in evidence evaluation that are neither automatically dismissive nor uncritically accepting. It means learning to appreciate the questions that alternative researchers raise while maintaining appropriate skepticism about the answers they propose. The skills involved in this kind of critical evaluation are increasingly important in an information environment where traditional authorities compete with alternative sources that operate according to different standards and assumptions. The ability to navigate between different knowledge systems, to identify valuable insights regardless of their source, and to integrate multiple perspectives into coherent understanding becomes essential for anyone seeking to make sense of complex contemporary challenges. In this context, Tartarian theory serves as more than just a historical hypothesis. It becomes a case study in how knowledge communities form and function, how evidence is interpreted and meaning is constructed, and how different approaches to investigation can yield different conclusions from the same underlying information. The ongoing evolution of Tartarian research also demonstrates how ideas and communities adapt in response to new information and changing circumstances. Early versions of the theory focus primarily on specific geographical regions and time periods. Contemporary versions have expanded to encompass global patterns and multiple civilizational cycles. Future developments may incorporate new discoveries, respond to criticism, or evolve in directions that current participants cannot predict. This evolutionary quality suggests that Tartarian theory functions less as a fixed set of beliefs than as a dynamic framework for exploring questions about human history and potential. Its value may lie not in providing definitive answers, but in keeping alive important questions that mainstream institutions have prematurely closed. The conversation between Tartarian believers and conventional historians also illustrates how knowledge advances through dialogue between different perspectives, even when those perspectives seem irreconcilable. Each side challenges the other to examine assumptions, refine methods, and articulate more clearly the basis for their conclusions. The result may not be consensus, but it often leads to better understanding of the complexities involved in reconstructing the past and planning the future. As we continue to explore these questions, we find ourselves confronting not just the mystery of whether Tartarian civilization existed, but the broader mystery of how human societies develop, sustain themselves, and sometimes collapse, despite their apparent strength and sophistication. Whether or not the specific claims about Tartaria prove correct, the investigation raises fundamental questions about civilizational resilience, the preservation of knowledge, and the factors that determine whether human achievements endure or disappear. These questions take on special urgency in an age when our own civilization faces challenges that could potentially lead to significant disruption or transformation. Climate change, technological disruption, social inequality, and international conflict all pose threats that could affect the stability and continuity of contemporary systems. Understanding how previous civilizations responded to similar challenges, whether successfully or unsuccessfully, becomes more than academic curiosity. The possibility that advanced civilizations have risen and fallen before us also raises questions about the assumptions underlying contemporary approaches to progress and development. If human societies have repeatedly achieved high levels of technological and social sophistication only to lose those achievements, then our current trajectory may be less secure than we assume. But the same possibility also suggests that human recovery and renewal may be more achievable than we imagine. If civilizations have collapsed and rebuilt before, then current problems may be temporary obstacles rather than permanent limitations. The capacity for renewal and reconstruction may be as fundamental to human nature as the tendency toward growth and development. The investigation of these possibilities requires moving beyond simple optimism or pessimism toward more sophisticated understanding of the factors that contribute to civilizational resilience or vulnerability. What makes societies capable of sustaining their achievements over long periods? What causes even advanced civilizations to become fragile and collapse? How can contemporary society learn from both the successes and failures of previous attempts at creating sustainable human civilization? These questions cannot be answered through historical investigation alone. They require integration of insights from multiple disciplines and perspectives, from archaeology and anthropology to systems theory and complexity science. They demand both rigorous analysis of available evidence and creative imagination about possibilities that may not be apparent in current conditions. The process of pursuing these questions also requires communities of inquiry that can bridge the gaps between different knowledge traditions and institutional frameworks. Neither mainstream academic institutions nor alternative research communities alone possess all the tools and perspectives necessary for addressing challenges of this complexity. Progress requires collaboration across boundaries that are often maintained by professional specialization, institutional competition, and ideological disagreement. In this sense, the Tartarian phenomenon points toward needs and possibilities that extend far beyond questions of historical accuracy. It suggests that human understanding of the past, present, and future requires forms of cooperation and integration that current institutions struggle to achieve. Whether or not Tartarian civilization existed as its believers claim, the investigation of their claims reveals gaps in our knowledge systems that need to be addressed regardless of how historical questions are ultimately resolved. The mystery deepens as we realize that our search for Tartaria has become a search for something larger than any single lost civilization. We are exploring the nature of knowledge itself, the mechanisms by which human understanding is constructed and transmitted, and the possibilities for creating forms of civilization that can sustain themselves across the challenges that time inevitably brings. In that exploration, we may discover that the most important secrets hidden in the ruins and anomalies that Tartarian researchers examine are not technological blueprints or historical facts, but insights into the processes by which human communities create meaning, preserve wisdom, and adapt to changing circumstances. These insights may prove more valuable than any specific knowledge about ancient energy systems or global empires, because they speak to capabilities that every generation must develop anew if human civilization is to continue and thrive. As our investigation continues into the deepest hours of the night, we find ourselves not with final answers, but with expanded questions, not with certain conclusions, but with enhanced appreciation for the mysteries that surround human history and potential. The search for Tartaria has become a search for understanding about the nature of civilizational rise and fall, the mechanisms of knowledge preservation and loss, and the possibilities for human achievement that may be greater than our current institutions allow us to imagine. And in that ongoing search, in that willingness to question what we think we know and explore what we might discover, we find something that no historical revision could ever erase: the human capacity for wonder, investigation, and the persistent belief that there is always more to learn about who we have been and who we might become. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through the shadows of forgotten history, though perhaps it is more accurate to say we have reached a new beginning. Tonight, we have walked together through the labyrinth of evidence and speculation that surrounds the greatest mystery of our time. We have examined photographs of impossible architecture, traced the disappearance of vast territories from ancient maps, and contemplated the mechanisms by which entire civilizations might vanish from human memory. Whether Tartaria existed as its believers claim, whether advanced civilizations have been systematically erased from our understanding, or whether these theories represent the creative interpretation of incomplete evidence, may never be definitively resolved. But in pursuing these questions, we have discovered something perhaps more valuable than any historical certainty. We have rediscovered our capacity to wonder, to question, and to imagine possibilities that extend beyond the boundaries of what we are told is real. The investigation continues in the minds of thousands of researchers around the world, in online communities that refuse to accept that all important questions have been answered, and in the hearts of everyone who suspects that the story of human civilization is far more complex and mysterious than our textbooks suggest. Each photograph examined, each pattern identified, each connection explored, adds another piece to a puzzle that may never be completed, but will never stop fascinating those who encounter it. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let these questions linger in your consciousness. Let them remind you that beneath the surface of accepted knowledge lies an ocean of possibility, and that the greatest discoveries may await not in distant galaxies, but in the forgotten corners of our own world. The mystery of Tartaria endures not because it provides easy answers, but because it keeps alive the most important questions about who we are, where we come from, and where we are going we come from, and what we might yet become. In the silence that follows, in the space between sleeping and waking, perhaps you will find your own doorway into the hidden histories that surround us, waiting patiently for minds curious enough to notice what others have chosen to ignore.